Good morning. It's no secret the main point of Jesus's teaching ministry was love. The foundation of his teaching was love. Someone asked him, "What's the greatest commandment?" And he says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." Love is the foundation. He did not make up those teachings. They weren't his idea. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength comes from the book of Deuteronomy. Love your neighbor as yourself is a direct quote from the book of Leviticus. And so those teachings weren't new, but as he taught them to people 2,000 years ago and as he teaches them to us, he did have an extra idea about them. And what he tried to do is expand our understanding of who is our neighbor, who we are to love. He spent the better part of 3 years expanding the idea of who falls under this rubric of loving our neighbor. Because let's face it, when we say love your neighbor, there is a tendency to be like, well, who's my neighbor? My neighbor's the people next door. My neighbor's the people in our neighborhood, right? People that are close. And while sometimes the people closest to us can be annoying, right? I mean, they also tend to be like us in a lot of ways, from the same country, probably with same perspectives on a lot of the same questions that we're wrestling with in society. Jesus' idea of who our neighbor is that, of course, people who are close to us. But he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan to stretch our notion of who our neighbor is. Because we all know, in Jesus' day, the Samaritans were a hated group of people. They were sort of like Jews, but they were just different enough that they didn't like them. Just similar enough that they didn't like them. And there was lots of animosity between the two groups, Samaritans and Judeans. And Jesus tells this parable of the Good Samaritan. And the hero of the parable is the Samaritan. He asks the guy who he tells this parable to at the end of the parable, which one of these was a neighbor to the other? And the guy has to be like, yeah, the one who showed mercy to the guy who was in the ditch, the Samaritan. So he takes that notion of neighbor and he takes the stakes out and he pitches a wider fence. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus will say, love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. Even if we don't look at the Samaritan as our enemy, there are enemies. Jesus' people had enemies back then, personal and national. And he says, we got to love them. Again, he picks up the stakes and widens the tent to where, who do we love? Well, it's basically everyone. I mean, who else falls in a category that's not neighbor, sort of neighbor, and enemy? Who else is left? Who do we love? We love everyone. Jesus spent a significant amount of his teaching ministry expanding our understanding of who we are to love. Today's gospel lesson, though, comes from Jesus' last night with his disciples. The Last Supper was just held. Jesus gets up from table, he washes his disciples' feet, and then he issues to his disciples a new commandment. On his last night with them, new commandment. And his commandment is to love one another as I have loved you. And we might look at that and go, well, that's strange. How is this a new commandment? Because he's been talking about love for years. Like, there's nothing new about this. It's the same thing he's been telling us. We haven't always done it, but it's the same thing. The new part of this commandment is that he says, love one another as I have loved you. He shifts from his long-held teaching on who we are to love to then start teaching how we are to love. And how we are to love is as he has loved us. And I think for the disciples sitting there, hearing those words from Jesus, they probably thought about the prior 3 years and all the ways that Jesus had loved them. They probably thought about the meal that they had just had, the Last Supper, where all of his disciples are present. There was no one left out of the RSVP list, including Judas. The wheels of betrayal were already in motion. And Jesus offers him a place at the table and offers him a share of his body and a share in his blood, knowing full well that in a few moments he's going to get up and go and actually betray him. Peter, who Jesus knows is going to deny even knowing him a few hours later. He says the cock will crow 3 times when you do it. Jesus knew it was coming. But he did not leave Peter out. Peter was welcome at that table. When Jesus set a table, he set not a narrow table, but a wide table. All were welcome. After getting up from that meal, as I said, he washed his disciples' feet, which is exactly what a slave did for anyone who would come into a household where that slave would be serving, walking around the Mediterranean in those days, either barefooted or with sandals on dirt, sandy roads. Your feet came in dusty, and so the slave, as soon as you came into the house, would wash the feet. Jesus wants to wash his disciples' feet. And Peter, it's not lost on Peter that this is a strange thing. Peter says to Jesus, "No, Lord, you will not wash my feet. I'm not going to let you, my Lord and Master, get down on your hands and knees and serve me. It should be the other way around." And Jesus says, No. I have to do this. Jesus serves them. He even serves the guy who's going to deny knowing him just a few hours later. And I'm sure as John wrote his gospel and as the disciples reflected back on this new commandment that Jesus gives on Jesus' last night with his disciples, they certainly would have taken into account what happens the next day, when for love of them and everyone in the world who has ever lived, ever existed, Jesus gave of himself completely and totally on the cross. Gave it all, sacrificing himself for others. As Jesus teaches in the Gospel of John, greater love has no one than to lay down their life for their friends. Jesus does not put himself in the center of his own life. He puts those around him at the center, feeding them, washing their feet, giving of his life. And so, hear those words afresh. Love one another as I have loved you. Like that. And for the last 2,000 years, the church as an institution has sometimes done that very well and has sometimes failed in heartbreaking ways. But in every age, in every place, there have been faithful saints who have lived among us and been little beacons of light and love in our communities. I can think back to my own childhood growing up in church. There were little saints there that would squeeze my cheeks and would love me. People who would take that church and form it into a second home for me. There were other people in my life, teachers, coaches, professors, the parents of friends who would love me in incredibly powerful ways. People I'm related to, people I'm not related to, and I'm sure you can think of people in your life who loved you extraordinarily with reckless abandon. And here at St. Mark's, we're filled with saints. I could go around the room and point you all out if you don't already know it. But as many of you know, as perhaps most of you know, today we are particularly recognizing and celebrating Mr. Roger Conover. There is no task around here too small or menial that Roger will not do with joy. I'll be here like on a Tuesday, and he'll show up. I'll go, "What are you doing here, Roger?" "Well, I'm painting a wall." "Oh, I'm checking on some lights, or I'm working in the archives." On Wednesday mornings, we have a Eucharist. Every week, Roger comes early. He lights the candles. He's already printed out the lessons. He's ready to completely run his side of the service. And when I'm unable to be there for whatever reason, I always say Father Roger, Father Conover, I call on. "Father Conover, can you say morning prayer this morning?" Or help us out. And of course, with joy, he says yes. There are a phrase, a sentence I've heard multiple times a month, every month, for as long as I've been here is, "I wish I had his genes." Who here has ever said that? Yeah. Or they'll say, "I wonder what his secret is." To live a life of longevity, but to look so good at it, and be humble about it, so much so that he allows the rector to beat him in tennis every so often. To live a life of humility, a lot of us saw him on the television for decades, but Roger, even though being on the television for decades, does not like the spotlight on himself. He did nothing for recognition or to be lifted up, and probably wants to crawl under the pew right at this moment. But I'm ending right now, so it's almost over. We've all asked that question. I want his. How do you get his genes, and what's his secret? And the thing I want to just float out there, the possibility is perhaps his secret isn't a secret. Perhaps he just loves really well. Perhaps the way that he lives and gives and loves is very close to, I think, what Jesus had in mind when he asked every single one of us to love one another as he loved us. And so today, we're giving thanks for Roger, and we could also use him as our inspiration. Don't just want his genes. Want his way of loving. Amen.